Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue on with our discussions of 1970s disaster movies. And today I'd like to touch upon a film that is from 1979, so it's in the tail end of this decade. And it is directed by Mark Robson, and also based on a novel by Colin Forbes, with screenplay credited to Abraham Polonsky. And it stars, among other people, in its really great cast. It stars Lee Marvin, Linda Evans, Maximilian Schell, Joe Namath, and Robert Shaw. And it is this film, which is called Avalanche Express. Now, before I go any further, I should point out that the director is Mark Robson, but unfortunately, the production details are such that Mark Robson died. He passed away prior to the completion of this, and so it meant that the film needed the participation of other filmmakers in order to get completed. So we understand that Monte Hellman and Gene Corman and also Robert Rietti had to participate in order to help with the completion of the film. And I understand that Gene Corman and Monte Hellman are acknowledged during the credits of this film. And I also mentioned Robert Rietti too, because his participation is important with regard to Robert Shaw, because another thing that we know about this film, unfortunately and very tragically, is that Robert Shaw too passed away before this film had been completed. And so this marks, therefore, the final film by Mark Robson, and also the final film that features Robert Shaw. And in those ways, I think it's a film that marks a very important part of the cinema legacies of these two individuals. And so in that way, I think this film is quite significant. And Robert Shaw's performance actually is really one of the great strengths of this, and I'll try to explain why throughout the course of this video. But returning to Avalanche Express. Now, perhaps for those who know this film, you might be wondering why it is I am talking about it, or I'm choosing to talk about it in the context of, say, 1970s disaster movies. True, it's a film from the 1970s, but is it really a disaster movie? After all, it probably is more appropriate to describe it first and foremost not as a disaster movie, but as a Cold War spy thriller action adventure, right? Because its story, in essence, is about a group of U.S. agents led by Lee Marvin's character, and their efforts at trying to protect a Soviet defector played by Robert Shaw, the legend Robert Shaw. And part of that, or the main component of the story, involves their riding the train, a particular train, the titular Avalanche Express. And they're on this train, and while they're riding the train, they have to deal with the antagonist forces, the enemy forces led by the Maximilian Schell character, and also they have to deal with various obstacles and challenges along the way. Now, herein lies the source or connection with the disaster genre, in my view. First of all, we do have this train component, which is, as I say, central to the whole plot and thrust of the film. And we have the forces that are trying to stop the protagonists, the group of heroes, as it were. This is a theme, or this is a treatment that could be said to be very similar to, say, a film that is also arguably part of the disaster genre, which is called The Cassandra Crossing, which involves a train and involves a group of passengers that are faced with various dilemmas and situations along the way in that particular film. And incidentally, I might talk about the Cassandra Crossing in a separate video later in this series, so please stay tuned for that. But in that way, we have a similar type of situation involving a train here in Avalanche Express. And also, one of those obstacles that our protagonists must face as they are riding the train in question is an avalanche sequence. Now, this avalanche sequence is, granted, maybe relatively speaking, only a very short amount of the overall running time of the film. So it doesn't occupy a majority of the running time, that's for sure. But it's still a very memorable sequence. It is very important and critical to the propulsion and thrust of the plot. It affects our heroes in a very significant way. It also is a very suspenseful sequence involving the movement of the train and a bridge and a nearby community and the nighttime and the sudden violence of this particular event, the avalanche. And we see not just the effects of this on the train, but also we see the effects of this on the communities that are nearby, and you also see our protagonists trying their best to deal with this particular situation. And so this is my way of suggesting that this sequence, I think, also forms the basis of perhaps counting this film within the disaster genre. Again, this is also another way perhaps to see the disaster genre as being a very malleable one. It's one that we can see various subcategorizations at work. And here perhaps we have an example of a disaster film that is also an action-adventure film. And it does have a very effective specific disaster involving an avalanche, but it also has the element of the train as well. I'm also reminded of, say, another film like Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, the Poseidon Adventure sequel. And that has elements of the disaster genre as well, but it also has elements of the protagonists and antagonists fighting against each other, and certain maybe gunfights and things of that nature. And so this type of overlapping of genre, I think, is a very, it's not just a commonality element, it's also, I think, very much part and parcel of the disaster genre itself. In other words, it provides much room for a lot of malleability. So this is an example of that I would suggest. Now, as a Cold War spy thriller, is it a successful one? Perhaps not. Perhaps one might look at it and might look at it some of the sequences to be maybe compared to some of the other famous Cold War spy thrillers of the age. Maybe this film might, in comparison, look a little bit bland or a little bit dated in some of the sequences. The film does involve a train, but there is setup that our characters must go through and plot exposition early on in the film before we actually get to the train sequence, which is, as I say, the main body of the film. So maybe for some it might seem like it's taking a little bit of time to set things up before we actually get on the train and get the plot moving. So maybe in those ways it might seem to be somewhat bland or somewhat flat in terms of those sequences. I know there are sequences also that might be attempting to generate a certain level of suspense as well, and it's again up to you as to whether those suspenseful scenes are indeed successful or not. Perhaps for some they are, perhaps for others they aren't. And for me, I will be honest, I think it does take a lot of time, in my view, to set things up. But when it gets to the train, I find it becomes very exciting for a number of reasons. First of all, the action sequences, I think, are very suspenseful. The characterizations, for example, Maximilian Schell's character, I think, is really effective. He has this air, this sense of menace and threat about him, which I think is very much key to having this film be pushed forward. Also, the characterizations of the agents, in particular Lee Marvin and Linda Evans, they have a very interesting dynamic vis-a-vis each other. Joe Namath, too, I must mention Joe Namath. There's a certain there's a certain sequence that occurs with respect to his character and what his character does that is really like very surprising. I really almost I just I felt a jolt when it happened, and so it was a very effective moment. And that's an example, I think, of where this film arguably would have maybe some flat moments within it, still contains some moments of jolt or excitement or energy that I think are really help the film along. And also I must mention in this regard Robert Shaw. Now Robert Shaw is he's one of the greats and one of my favorites. And this film, it is of course his last film that we know, but it is so sublime in terms of Robert Shaw performance. Now, of course, there is perhaps for some it might be there might be something to be said about the fact that we're not actually getting Robert Shaw's voice, his actual voice in the performance. Still, I think the combination of the voice acting and the Robert Shaw performance, I think, works. And would I have liked to have heard Robert Shaw's actual voice? And of course I would. Of course I think Robert Shaw has one of those great electrifying voices. But still, given the circumstances, I think what we're getting here is very, very good. And we are getting the Robert Shaw performance, his demeanor, his look on screen, and his manner about him, which is undeniably electric. There's a lot of magnetism to his on-screen presence, and so it's really great to see this shine through, as it were, in this really interesting character that he has. It's a very heroic one in many aspects, and also there are some very, very interesting scenes that he has. In particular, I would, for those of you who are interested, I would point your attention to a particular scene that he has in the train where he's talking to the Linda Evans character about an aspect of his background, and there's a way that he's talking and it turns slightly comic and surreal, and then suddenly turns tragic and sad and somber, and that weight of drama is contained within this 2 to 3 minute dialogue sequence that he shares with Linda Evans, and so that is very effective. And so I think that's yet another example of where there is a jolt of energy within this film that serves the film very well. Now, again, to take a step back here, is it the best film that I've ever seen? No, I'm not claiming that at all. And I would also further acknowledge that I do see, as I indicated earlier, some faults in terms of maybe some of the way in which the action, maybe at the start of the film, or how it provides plot exposition, might seem a little bit slow-paced, maybe a bit too slow-paced for my own sort of viewing pleasure, as it were. But there are still a lot of those moments that I was trying to indicate where it does have these jolts, and those jolts, I think, are enough for me to carry me through and to feel entertained by the end of the film. And I'm also very moved by a lot of the aspects of the performances, in particular Robert Shaw. I didn't mention Lee Marvin, but I think Lee Marvin has a really good, he does the Lee Marvin thing, and there's this command and presence about him. So it's a wonderful presence that he has there. And Linda Evans too, there is a nice balance that her character provides in this ensemble piece. So I like the characterizations, I like the performances, and among those, of course, is the great performance by the great performer Robert Shaw, and that legacy that he carries through. I think it shines through in this one final screen performance. And as I say, his characterization is heroic. It's also tragic, and he brings all of this to the table in, I think, a very quietly effective way in this film, Avalanche Express. And finally, to bring it back to the disaster genre, as I was trying to indicate before, it does have, I would suggest, those disaster elements. And indeed, while the disaster elements arguably might not be front and center of the film, they are still quite essential components, and perhaps to some, they might be the standout highlight components of the film, in which case I think we can have this film in the discussion of disaster films from the 1970s. And so, my friends, this is the film Avalanche Express. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.